I feel still very shamed about it because I was raised in the 50s and, it's ingrained in me. And I was 17. I had no choices in my life. I didn't have a lot of family support in any way, or finance.
That's Sally Field not in a role, but speaking about her real life. For decades, the public knew her as a Norma Rae, the woman who stood up for justice. They loved her as Mrs. Gump, the mother who would do anything to protect her son. On screen, she became a symbol of strength and protection. But in her own life, when she needed it most, she didn't have that protection. That contrast raises an unavoidable question. What really happened in her early years? And how did it shape the person the world would later come to know? What the world saw was only part of the story. To understand it more clearly, we need to go back to the beginning, to the very home where it all began. Hell in a picture-perfect home. Every great tragedy often begins within a setting that appears deceptively perfect, and Sally Field's story is no exception. In a sun-drenched home in Pasadena, California, the stage was set for what looked like a classic Hollywood fairy tale. Her mother, Margaret Field, was a beautiful actress whose career was modest, leaving her with a fragile sense of security and a deep desire for stability. After divorcing Sally's biological father in 1950, Margaret remarried a man named Jock Mahoney, who seemed to be the very embodiment of the strong, protective figure that Hollywood loves to create. Standing at an imposing 6 feet 4 inches, Mahoney was a former Marine, a stuntman, and had even played the role of Tarzan on screen, making him appear to be the ideal guardian for a young family. Sally Field was only 4 years old when she stepped into that house, unknowingly beginning a nightmare that would last for exactly 10 years, ending only when she turned 14. To any outsider looking in, this was the quintessential American family, complete with a lovely actress, a silver screen hero, and happy children playing in the yard. From the inside, however, it was a prison without windows for a small, helpless little girl. The abuse inflicted by Jock Mahoney was not loud or violent in a way that would alert the neighbors. Instead, it was silent and insidious, taking place in darkened rooms after everyone else had gone to sleep. He would slip into Sally's bedroom and commit acts that a child's mind could not possibly comprehend, let alone process. The most devastating part of this abuse was not merely the physical violation, but the silent, systematic programming of toxic lessons directly into her young, developing emotional operating system. With each instance of abuse, a new line of damaging code was installed. The first command was, "I am not worthy of protection." A child's natural instinct is to believe that their parents are their ultimate protectors, so when the person in the father role becomes the attacker, that core belief is shattered. The child begins to internalize the blame, concluding that something must be wrong with them, that they are somehow the cause of this terrible thing. The second command was even more confusing. Love and pain can coexist in the same person. Jock Mahoney was not a monster 24 hours a day. During the daytime, he could be a charming and fun stepfather who took her on outings and praised her. This stark contrast created a deadly emotional confusion, teaching Sally that the same person who shows you affection can also be the source of your deepest pain, a destructive pattern that would haunt every single one of her future romantic relationships. However, the ultimate tragedy, the wound that cut the deepest and proved the most difficult to heal, came from a different kind of betrayal. It was a dual betrayal, one that was in many ways more horrific than the actions of the abuser himself. Her mother, Margaret Field, knew what was happening. She did not just have suspicions, she had seen it with her own eyes. In her memoir, In Pieces, Sally recounts a devastating memory of seeing her mother's silhouette standing in the doorway of her bedroom, observing Mahoney's actions, and then silently turning away and closing the door. In that moment, her mother made a conscious choice not to intervene. She chose to protect the fragile family structure she had built instead of protecting her own vulnerable daughter. Decades later, shortly before her death, Margaret finally confessed to Sally that she had known all along. She explained that she had been too scared, too weak, and too terrified of losing the financial stability that Mahoney provided. She couldn't bear the thought of becoming a single mother again. That admission was, for Sally, more devastating than the 10 years of abuse she had endured. The attacker was a man who had entered her life as a stepfather, but the silent accomplice was the one person on earth who was supposed to be her unwavering rock. Her mother's silence sent a final, soul-crushing message. Your pain is not as important as my comfort. With that, the very foundation of safety in Sally's world completely crumbled. She was not just a victim of abuse, she was a victim of the most profound betrayal imaginable, abandoned by the person who gave her life. The house in Pasadena was not a sunny paradise. It was a living hell illuminated by the bright, unforgiving California sun, and from that point on, Sally learned she had to survive on her own. She became an expert at making herself small and invisible, a master at reading the emotions of others to keep herself safe, and a prodigy at smiling while her world was falling apart. These were the survival skills of a traumatized child, and as fate would have it, they were also the foundational skills of a brilliant actress. Building a career from the rubble. When a child is unable to articulate their pain with words, they will instinctively search for another language to express it. And for Sally Field, that language became acting. For her, performance was not a form of escapism to run away from reality. It was a unique and essential survival tool. The stage offered her the only space where she could translate the chaotic, nameless, and unspeakable emotions swirling inside her into something the outside world could see, understand, and, most importantly, love. In a role she could cry without having to explain why, she could scream without being judged, and she could reveal her vulnerability without feeling weak. Her high school drama club became the first and only truly safe harbor in her young life. In 1965, at the age of 19, Sally landed her first major television role as the star of the series Gidget. She played a fun-loving, optimistic teenage surfer, an image that quickly made her America's sweetheart and the nation's favorite girl next door. Shortly after, from 1967 to 1970, she solidified this persona with her role as the bubbly Sister Bertrille in The Flying Nun. The public saw a petite, adorable young woman with a radiant smile and sparkling eyes, completely unaware that this smile was a carefully constructed mask forged over a decade of private torment. The contrast between her public image and her internal reality could not have been more extreme. While America laughed at the cheerful antics of a nun who could fly, Sally was privately grappling with a shattered soul, crippling feelings of worthlessness, and a pervasive, constant fear. Her personal life became a direct reflection of the trauma patterns established in her childhood. She entered her first marriage with Stephen Craig in 1968, with whom she had two sons, but the marriage ended in 1975. This was followed by her famous, turbulent, and highly publicized relationship with actor Burt Reynolds. Although their connection was genuine, it was also chaotic and deeply unhealthy. In her memoir, Sally admitted that she constantly repeated the old, familiar pattern of shrinking herself to be accepted and loved. She molded herself into the woman she thought Burt wanted her to be, consistently suppressing her own needs and feelings to please him. She had been programmed from a young age to believe that love required self-sacrifice and that she had to make herself smaller to avoid being abandoned, which was the exact lesson her mother and stepfather had taught her. Unconsciously, every role Sally took was a quiet attempt to reenact the version of life she had craved since she was a little girl. A life where she was protected, cherished, and loved unconditionally without having to sacrifice any part of herself. She desperately wanted to be seen and valued for who she truly was, not just for the cheerful persona she presented to the world. Her second marriage to film producer Alan Greisman in 1984, which gave her a third son, ultimately followed the same pattern and ended in 1994. She continued to search for safety and validation from the men in her life, failing to realize that the original wound was the absence of that very safety and protection from the people who should have provided it from the very beginning. By the mid-1970s, Hollywood had firmly typecast Sally Field, placing her in a restrictive box labeled cute and funny. The industry saw her only as Gidget or the Flying Nun, a lightweight comedic actress incapable of dramatic depth. They were not interested in the complex human being behind the smile. They were only interested in the product they had helped create. But the real Sally Field, the survivor who had walked through hell, could not be contained in that box forever. A quiet rebellion began to stir within her, because she knew she had so much more to offer. She understood that her inner pain could be transformed into extraordinary artistic power, if only she were given the chance. All she needed was one role to show the world who she really was. When wounds became a superpower, Hollywood's dismissive attitude became the powerful fuel for Sally Field's transformation. Feeling trapped by the industry's narrow perception, she made a conscious decision to break out of the box herself, without waiting for anyone's permission. She quietly enrolled at the legendary Actors Studio in New York, a place renowned for training some of the greatest actors in history. There, she underwent rigorous training with the iconic Lee Strasberg, who taught the principles of method acting, a technique that requires actors to draw upon their own personal memories and emotions to build a character. For Sally, this was both an immense artistic challenge and a form of painful therapy, as it forced her to confront the very demons she had spent years trying to bury. Her first major breakthrough came in 1976 with her role in the television movie Sybil. Sally portrayed a young woman suffering from what is now known as dissociative identity disorder, developing 16 distinct personalities as a result of horrific childhood abuse. This was no longer just acting, it was a public soul-searching. Sally channeled her own experiences of feeling fragmented, the scared little girl, the people-pleasing young woman, the angry survivor, to breathe life into the character with a terrifying authenticity. Her performance was a cultural earthquake, so raw and painful that it left audiences stunned. For this role, Sally Field won her first Emmy Award, and for the first time, Hollywood was forced to see her not as a cute girl, but as a serious, dramatic artist of incredible depth. The success of Sybil paved the way for the role that would define her career. In 1979, she was cast as the lead in the film Norma Rae, playing a textile factory worker in the American South who is overlooked and dismissed by society, but rises up to fight for justice and unionize her fellow workers. Sally did not just play Norma Rae, she was Norma Rae. She intimately understood the feeling of being underestimated, of having her voice taken away, and above all, she understood the simmering fire of righteous anger inside a woman determined to reclaim her dignity. The iconic scene where Norma Rae stands on a factory table and silently holds up a sign that reads "Union" is one of the most powerful moments in American cinema. In that moment, it was Sally Field's voice, the voice of the little girl who was never allowed to speak up, that was finally being heard around the world. In 1980, her powerful portrayal earned her the Academy Award for Best Actress. 4 years later, she made history again. For her role as Edna Spaulding in Places in the Heart, 1984, a resilient widow fighting to save her family's farm during the Great Depression, Sally once more won over the Academy. When she walked onto the stage to accept her second Oscar, she delivered one of the most memorable and misunderstood speeches in the award's history. Looking out at her cheering peers, she said with raw emotion, "I can't deny the fact that you like me. Right now you like me." Many in the audience and the media dismissed it as a naive or unprofessional comment, but they missed the profound truth hidden within those words. That was not the voice of a Hollywood star basking in glory. It was the silent cry of a child who had spent nearly 40 years feeling unloved and unaccepted for who she really was. It was the voice of little Sally, who always had to perform, to be good, to shrink herself, just to receive a scrap of affection. In that moment, under the bright lights and in front of millions of people, the wounded child inside Sally Field finally felt seen, validated, and liked for her true self. "You like me" was not a statement of ego, but a tearful affirmation for a lifetime spent yearning for acceptance. Her greatest roles were always deeply intertwined with her own life. Norma Rae was the rebellious spirit inside Sally, finally breaking free, and her later portrayal of Mrs. Gump in Forrest Gump, 1994, was another profoundly meaningful act. Mrs. Gump represented the perfect mother, unconditionally loving, fiercely protective, and absolutely believing in her child against all odds. She was the exact mother that Sally had always needed but never had. By becoming Mrs. Gump on screen, Sally was able to give herself and the world the healing gift of that perfect, unwavering love. Belated healing and a true legacy. After her two divorces, Sally Field raised her three sons as a single mother, an experience that became her most important role and her most powerful act of healing. She was determined to break the cycle of trauma that had defined her own childhood. In her home, she created an environment where her sons always felt safe, heard, and loved unconditionally, providing them with everything she had been denied. In doing so, she became the very mother she had always desperately needed. As her life continued, she faced new personal challenges. In 2005, at the age of 59, she was diagnosed with osteoporosis, but instead of suffering in silence, she turned her personal struggle into a public platform. She became a vocal advocate for bone health awareness, encouraging women everywhere to get tested. Once again, she transformed her private vulnerability into a collective strength, a pattern that had become a hallmark of her life and career. A moment of profound cinematic tragedy occurred on November 6, 2011. It was Sally Field's 65th birthday, and it was also the day her mother, Margaret Field, passed away. This cruel irony felt like a final tragic chapter written by fate itself. The woman who had both given her life and been the source of her deepest betrayal was gone, leaving Sally with a painful but necessary freedom to finally and fully confront her past. Following her mother's death, Sally embarked on the most difficult journey of her life, writing her story. For 7 long years, she painstakingly worked on her memoir, In Pieces. It was an excruciating process that required her to excavate every painful memory, every buried emotion, and every ounce of pain she had suppressed for over 6 decades. She had to face the truth about her stepfather, and even more painfully, the truth about her mother's complicity. When the book was finally published in 2018, as Sally turned 71, it was not an act of confession or a plea for sympathy. It was the ultimate act of reclaiming control over her own narrative. For most of her life, her story had been defined by her roles, by her relationships, and by her silence. Within Pieces, she was finally the one holding the pen, the one telling the story. She gave herself the power to define her own truth. Today, at 79, Sally Field is not pursuing a fairy tale ending. Her body still deals with illness, and the memories will always be a part of her. But her spirit has reached a state far deeper than simple happiness. It has reached a state of acceptance. She accepts the broken pieces of her life without trying to glue them back together perfectly. She has embraced her role as a grandmother, breaking the traumatic cycle and providing a new generation with the love she never had. She approaches aging with honesty, without hiding her wrinkles or her weariness. The core message of this final act of her life is crystal clear. She spent 60 years of her life making the world feel safe and understood through her characters. Now in her later years, she is finally learning how to provide that same sense of safety for herself. She no longer needs the approval of Hollywood, of men, or of the public. The only approval that matters now is that of the little girl who still lives inside of her. And by writing her truth, she has finally given that little girl the apology and the embrace she waited a lifetime to receive. The woman behind the legend. The true legacy of Sally Field is not found in the 2 golden Oscar statues on her shelf or in the hundreds of unforgettable roles she brought to life. Her greatest legacy is the nearly 8-decade-long journey from a silenced victim in her own home to the courageous woman who picked up a pen and rewrote her own destiny. She proved to the world that the greatest strength is not in never falling, but in rising from the ashes, looking your wounds directly in the eye, and declaring, "This is my story, and I will be the one to tell it." She taught us that behind the most radiant smile can lie the deepest pain, and that art can be the most powerful alchemy for turning that pain into light. What does it tell us about the human spirit that a woman who carried such profound wounds could still create so much warmth and brilliance for the rest of the world? Her story serves as a powerful reminder to anyone carrying a silent burden that they are not alone and that their voice deserves to be heard. It shows us that healing is not about erasing the past, but about integrating it into who we are. Behind every legend is an ordinary person, and in Sally Field's case, it is an ordinary person who refused to let their trauma write the final chapter of their life.